In December of 1945, in the dry hills of Upper Egypt, a quiet discovery began to unfold. Near the town of Nag Hammadi, along the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, two brothers named Muhammad and Khalifa al-Saman were digging for sabak, a type of natural fertilizer used for crops. It was a normal task. The Nile Valley had supported farming for thousands of years, and the desert cliffs nearby often held rich soil deposits. As Muhammad later described, his shovel struck something hard. Buried in the earth was a large, sealed clay jar, almost 3 feet tall. At first, he hesitated to break it open. He worried it might contain a jinn, a spirit from local folklore. But curiosity won. He smashed the jar with his tool. Inside were not coins or treasure, but books. 13 leather-bound codices, wrapped and stacked inside the jar. Their pages were made of papyrus. The writing was in Coptic, the language used by Egyptian Christians in late antiquity. The brothers did not recognize the value of what they had found. Some pages were reportedly burned at home as kindling. Others were sold piece by piece in local markets. It would take months before scholars understood that something extraordinary had surfaced. Over time, the manuscripts were traced, collected, and studied. By 1946, word reached authorities in Cairo. Eventually, most of the codices were gathered and transferred to the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they remain today. What had been sealed in that jar turned out to be one of the most important manuscript discoveries of the 20th century. The collection became known as the Nag Hammadi Library. In total, it contained more than 50 separate texts. Among them were writings that scholars had only known through fragments or references. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. Many of these texts were connected to early Christian movements, often described as Gnostic. Before 1945, most knowledge of these groups came from their critics. Early church leaders like Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the 2nd century, had described and condemned what they considered heretical teachings. But their accounts were one-sided. They quoted pieces of texts, summarized ideas, and argued against them. The original works themselves were thought to be lost. Now suddenly, physical copies existed. Scholars who began studying the codices, including Jean Dorès and later James M. Robinson, quickly realized the importance of the find. Linguistic analysis showed that the Coptic manuscripts were copied in the 4th century AD. Carbon dating of the papyrus supported that timeframe. But many of the writings themselves were translations from earlier Greek originals, likely composed in the 2nd century. In other words, these texts had been buried for around 1,600 years. The physical condition of the codices told its own story. They were carefully bound in leather covers. Some were wrapped in linen. They were not tossed into the ground carelessly. The jar had been sealed. Whoever placed them there intended for them to stay hidden. But why? To understand that question, we need to step back into the 4th century. By this time, Christianity had changed dramatically. After Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, the religion moved from being persecuted to being protected by the Roman state. Over the next decades, church leaders worked to define official doctrine. Councils were held. Creeds were written. In 367 AD, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, issued his famous Festal Letter. In it, he listed the 27 books that would later become the New Testament. He also warned against other writings that he considered false or dangerous. Around the same period, monasteries were growing across Egypt. One of the largest monastic movements was founded by Pachomius. His communities were located not far from where the Nag Hammadi jar was discovered. Some historians have suggested that monks connected to this movement may have owned the codices. The theory is simple. If certain texts were being condemned or discouraged, monks who valued them might have chosen to hide them rather than destroy them. Burying them in a sealed jar in the desert cliffs would protect them from both church authorities and decay. There is evidence that monastic libraries existed in the region, and the leather bindings suggest careful production, not casual copying. Still, there is no direct record linking the codices to a specific monastery. No note inside explains the burial. No ancient historian mentions a hidden collection. This is where the mystery becomes quiet but powerful. The burial appears deliberate. The timing fits a period of theological tension. Yet, we do not know who made the decision. Was it an act of preservation, meant for future generations? Or was it a respectful disposal of texts that were no longer approved? In ancient Egypt, burying sacred objects was sometimes seen as a proper way to retire them. Researchers also debate how widely these writings were used before they were hidden. Were they read only by small, isolated groups? Or were they more common than we assume? The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains sayings attributed to Jesus, some similar to those found in the canonical Gospels, others quite different. Its existence suggests a diversity of belief in early Christianity that was more complex than later tradition often admits. What is certain is that after the 4th century, the trail goes silent. For roughly 16 centuries, the jar remained buried in the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif. Empires rose and fell. The region saw Byzantine rule, Islamic expansion, Ottoman administration, and modern Egyptian governance. Through all of it, the codices stayed hidden. No record marked their location. No map pointed to their resting place. Their survival depended entirely on chance. When we think about discoveries in history, we often imagine planned excavations or organized searches. But the Nag Hammadi library was not uncovered by a team of archaeologists. It was found by farmers digging for fertilizer. If Muhammad al-Saman had chosen a different spot, or if the jar had broken centuries earlier, these texts might never have reached us. Today, scholars continue to study the codices in detail. High-resolution photography, updated translations, and careful preservation work have helped protect them. The Coptic Museum in Cairo safeguards the majority of the collection. Researchers from around the world consult these texts to better understand the early centuries of Christianity. Yet the central question remains unanswered. Who buried the jar, and what did they hope would happen? The Nag Hammadi Library is not a legend or a rumor. It is a documented discovery, grounded in physical evidence and careful scholarship. But at its heart is a simple human act. Someone gathered these books, someone sealed them inside a jar, someone carried them to the desert cliffs and placed them underground, and then they walked away. For 1,600 years, the desert kept their secret. When the Nag Hammadi codices were finally gathered and studied in Cairo, scholars quickly realized that the real mystery was not only why the books had been buried, it was what they actually said. Among all the texts, one stood out almost immediately: the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas does not tell a story about Jesus' birth, miracles, death, or resurrection. There is no narrative, no timeline. Instead, it is a collection of 114 sayings, many beginning with the phrase, "Jesus said." Some of these sayings sound familiar. Others are strikingly different. For example, several lines closely resemble verses found in Matthew or Luke. That raised an important question. Could the Gospel of Thomas preserve very early traditions about Jesus, perhaps even independent of the New Testament? Some scholars, including Elaine Pagels and Helmut Koester, have suggested that parts of Thomas may reflect early oral traditions. Others, such as Bart D. Ehrman, argue that the text likely developed later, shaped by 2nd century theological ideas rather than 1st century eyewitness memory. Most researchers today agree on at least one point. The version found at Nag Hammadi was copied in the 4th century, but the Greek original was likely written sometime in the 2nd century AD. That places it decades after the canonical Gospels were already circulating. Still, the debate over its sources continues, and Thomas is only one piece of the collection. The Nag Hammadi library includes texts like the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and the Hypostasis of the Archons. These writings explore ideas about creation, divine knowledge, and the nature of the spiritual world. Many of them reflect beliefs that modern scholars group under the term Gnosticism. But here is where careful study matters. Gnosticism was not a single church or unified movement. It was a broad label later scholars used to describe certain early Christian groups that emphasized gnosis, or spiritual knowledge. These groups often believed that salvation came through understanding hidden truths about the divine. Some texts describe the material world as flawed or incomplete, created by a lesser divine being rather than the highest God. In the Apocryphon of John, for example, there is a detailed story about the creation of the world that differs from the Genesis account. The text describes layers of heavenly beings and spiritual realms. It is complex, symbolic, and deeply theological. For centuries, historians only knew of such teachings because early church leaders criticized them. Now, for the first time, scholars could read these ideas directly from original sources. That changed everything. Before 1945, knowledge of so-called heretical movements came mostly from writers like Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, and Hippolytus. They quoted fragments of opposing texts in order to argue against them. It was like hearing only one side of a debate. The discovery at Nag Hammadi allowed historians to compare those criticisms with the actual writings. James M. Robinson, who led a major translation project in the 1970s, helped bring the codices to an English-speaking audience. His work, along with that of the International Committee for the Nag Hammadi Codices, opened the door for broader academic study. Scholars began to see early Christianity not as a single unified movement from the beginning, but as a diverse and sometimes competing set of communities. Still, many questions remain unresolved. One of the biggest debates centers on authorship. None of the texts clearly identify their true authors. Titles like Gospel of Thomas or Gospel of Philip were likely added later. Were these writings composed by direct followers of Jesus? Most scholars say that is unlikely. The language, themes, and theological structures suggest second-century origins. Yet the possibility that they contain older traditions cannot be completely ruled out. Another issue concerns influence. How widespread were these ideas? Were Gnostic Christians small, isolated groups on the edges of the Roman world? Or were they part of a larger conversation happening within early Christianity itself? Archaeological evidence gives only limited answers. We do not have large church buildings or clearly labeled Gnostic communities from that time. What we do have are texts, copied carefully and preserved long enough to be buried. That alone suggests they were valued by someone. And then there is the question that lingers quietly behind all of this. Why were the codices buried instead of destroyed? If church authorities were rejecting certain texts, burning them would have been an effective way to eliminate them. In fact, throughout history, banned books have often been burned. Yet, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were placed in a sealed jar, wrapped and protected. Some historians suggest that monks from the nearby Pachomian monasteries may have hidden them after Athanasius issued his list of approved scriptures in 367 AD. Perhaps they feared punishment if the books were discovered. Others think the burial may have been a respectful way of disposing of texts that were no longer allowed, but still considered sacred in some sense. There is no written record explaining the act. No letter, no diary entry, no ancient historian describing the moment. We are left with physical evidence and informed interpretation. Today, the codices are preserved at the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Conservation experts monitor their condition carefully. Scholars continue to refine translations as new linguistic tools become available. Digital imaging allows researchers to examine damaged pages in greater detail than ever before. Over the past decades, interpretations have shifted. Early excitement sometimes overstated how radically these texts challenged Christian tradition. More recent scholarship tends to be more measured. The Nag Hammadi writings are now seen as part of the rich and varied landscape of early Christian thought, rather than secret alternatives waiting to replace the Bible. Even so, the discovery reshaped how historians understand the first few centuries of Christianity. It revealed that debates about doctrine, authority, and interpretation were happening much earlier than many assumed. It showed that communities were exploring different ways to understand the teachings of Jesus. And yet, despite decades of research, the deeper mystery remains intact. If the jar had never been broken open in 1945, our picture of early Christianity would look very different. We would still rely heavily on critics like Irenaeus for information about these groups. We might assume that certain ideas were rare or insignificant. Instead, we now know that alternative writings were copied, bound, and read carefully enough to survive into the 4th century. The Nag Hammadi library is not a mystery of fantasy or hidden treasure. It is a mystery of preservation, power, and memory. A small decision made in late antiquity, to bury a set of books rather than destroy them, changed modern scholarship forever. One sealed jar in the Egyptian desert forced historians to reconsider centuries of assumption. And even now, as scholars continue to study those fragile pages, one question gently remains in the background. Who chose to protect these words, and what future were they hoping for?